Onwards to Chapter 5 of Amy's Eyes. Bobby Shaftow's gone to sea, silver buckles at his knee. He'll come back and marry me, pretty Bobby Shaftow. Bobby Shaftow's fat and fair, combing down his yellow hair. He's my love for evermore, pretty Bobby Shaftow. It is Sunday, some while yet. Day it is, the Sabbath, and it is difficult to get up from one place and go to another. The sun in the sky hardly moves. It is noontime for hours. Afternoons last a week. The children play slower and chew their food slower, and if a child has reason to beat someone, it is a slower beating, so that a beating you might endure for 3 minutes on a Wednesday, for example, you would have to suffer for a half hour on a Sunday. The ladies of St. Anne's were caught up in this backwater of time also. They turned their heads slower toward a commotion, and then they saw less of it, for they blinked slower, and they heard slower too, and they had long, slow thoughts about when they were young. The children of St. Anne's did not suspect that the ladies had thoughts about their youth. The ladies were generally thought to have been brand newly hatched at middle age, 35 years old forever. So it was a perfect day to sneak into the ladies' library. Amy slung the bag over her shoulder and crouched under the weight. A quick-witted, wide-eyed girl had the advantage on a Sunday afternoon, and her heels might trip around a corner before one of the ladies could see. On any other day, Amy would hardly have dared to sneak into the ladies' library. It lay directly off to the left of the front doors of St. Anne's. Across the hall was the office, and next to the library was the ladies' parlor. Amy passed around the side of the stone building, stooping close against it. She paused behind a stone pillar at the bottom of the front steps. The great front door was open. Amy planned a quick run up the stairs, and then a dodge into the library. If she were to be caught, there was no major punishment for it, perhaps no playtime after supper. But she did worry about the crew of that ship all frozen and lying about icebound and starving just because the captain didn't know exactly where Tasmania was. Amy took a deep breath and was just about to run up the steps, but she had waited too long. There was a bark behind her. It was the big dog with the long legs, older now, but just as wise as ever. He lowered his head as he approached and growled, then touched his nose to Amy's bag. Men sometimes came to St. Anne's. The post rider came almost every day of the week, so the dog knew the smell of a man. In his long life, this was new to him, and he knew it was bad. It would have been worse if he'd come upon a man carrying Amy in a bag, but this was bad enough. "Shoo!" Amy said. But the dog caught the bag in his teeth and began shaking his head back and forth, growling more deeply and louder now, and he and Amy were in a tug-of-war. "Let go! Let go!" Amy commanded him. But he backed with his hind legs and worried and tugged all the more. The captain cried out to know what was happening. "The dog! The dog!" cried Amy. "Take me out! Run!" cried the captain. It was the best plan, for the dog would never let go of the bag. It was ripping now, and soon the dog would be at him. Undoing the top, Amy grabbed the captain by an arm and dashed up the front steps. She ducked through the front door, and in a few steps down the polished wooden floor, she slipped inside the library. Amy and the captain sat side by side at the closed door, listening to the dog outside. He was tearing the bag into slobbery strips. Discovering that the quarry had escaped, he left the shreds and began barking, then went sniffing about to find the vanished man. Amy caught her breath, took her ear from the door, and looked about the room. It was a wonderful library. 3 of the walls were lined with books, all made with great care and love. Leather-bound books with pages like fine cream, with each individual letter of every word pressed into the page. Some were bound in supple Moroccan leather, some in sheepskin, with reinforced corners and ribs along the spine. Many were painted with gold all around the edges of the page. Tight and sturdy books, all of them, with their titles all stamped in gold, and the titles A Treasure of Study, all in themselves. Amy and the captain surveyed all this wealth, and the captain saw at once what was needed. "Up there," he said. "See, up there, those very tall books. Those would be atlases and books with charts. You'll need a chair to reach them, sis." In the middle of the room was the oak table with 6 chairs along the sides, heavy chairs with plush velvet seats. Amy and the captain pulled one of them over to set beneath the tall books. Amy hopped up on the chair and was reaching for one of the books when they heard voices right outside the library door. Amy jumped off the chair. She and the captain tumbled over the back of the couch and huddled next to the wall below a window, listening. "What was all that racket outside about?" said Mrs. Hill. She had grasped the doorknob, but paused. "The dog was bothering something," said Miss Quince. She was now the second most high lady at St. Anne's. Missy Clare was there also. She now the third most high lady at St. Anne's. The 3 ladies entered the library. Noticing at once that one chair was out of place, set over against a wall of books, they all 3 went to inspect. "Footprints," said Miss Quince, touching the dusty print of the plush velvet. "One of the 10-year-olds, I should say, by the size of it." "Never mind," said Mrs. Hill, brushing the print away and turning toward the table. "We've more important business at hand." Positioning the chair in its proper place at the long table, the 3 high ladies sat themselves down, all with their hands folded atop the polished wood. These 3 ladies, by virtue of their longevity, had the power of law in all matters within the iron fence and stone walls of St. Anne's. Mrs. Hill, being the highest of the high ladies, established her authority by keeping a silence for a few moments, looking at her clasped hands. The other 2 ladies waited in silence. With a deep sigh, Mrs. Hill raised her head and spoke. "We have a problem at St. Anne's, a unique situation that calls upon our deliberation and wisdom. It's about Amy." "More precisely, about the captain," said Miss Quince. "About Amy and the captain, to be more precise," said Mrs. Hill. "And we are grateful to Miss Quince for noticing how it is with the captain." "He wouldn't likely fool me," said Miss Quince, fidgeting with her clasped hands and smiling tightly. "Perhaps it will go no further than it has," said Missy Clare, making her plea toward Mrs. Hill. "I should say it's gone quite far enough already," said Miss Quince. "I caught another glimpse of him this morning." "But he is only a doll," said Missy Clare. "There is very little of the doll in him any more," said Miss Quince. "I tell you he is a real person, half as big as Amy already, and growing each day." "But he's such a little man," said Missy Clare. "There, that is the whole matter of it. You say it yourself. He is a man." "Ladies, said Mrs. Hill, with a quiet gesture to each of them. "Missy Clare is only thinking of Amy's feelings, of that I'm sure. And although a defense in the captain's favor is good-hearted, I think we all agree that something must be done." Missy Clare lowered her head. That was beyond doubt. Mrs. Hill continued. "It is only a question of what must be done." "I say put him in a bread box," said Miss Quince. "You would." Missy Clare raised her head and was about to make protest, but Mrs. Hill held up her hand. "That is one of the choices we have," she said. "Miss Quince has assured me that he would fit nicely in a bread box, whereupon he might be kept on a pantry shelf." "Oh, please," said Missy Clare plaintively, "not the bread box. It would break Amy's heart. He is such a little man, after all, and no harm. Only a week ago he was a doll, and perhaps he'll change back again." "If we could depend on that, there would be no problem," said Mrs. Hill. "But there is ample reason to believe that as long as the captain is under Amy's influence, he will continue to grow. And we cannot confine the problem alone to a consideration of Amy's feelings. There are—" Mrs. Hill cleared her throat. "There are the older girls to consider." "And he is," Miss Quince put in. And then she began the sentence again for added emphasis. "He is, after all, a sailor." There was no argument about that. There was a silence for a moment devoted to imagining the peril that a sailor represented to the older girls. These were, at least, the perilous imaginings of Mrs. Hill and Miss Quince. Missy Clare cherished this silence for other memories. She spoke next in a voice that surprised the other 2 ladies by its wistfulness. "I knew a sailor once," said Missy Clare, gazing toward the window. The other 2 ladies looked at Missy Clare with a curiosity that had not been freshened for many years. Unclasping her hands, and laying them palms down on the table, Missy Clare gazed through the mist of time, as she moved one index finger to touch the other. She said again, this time in a voice full of resignation and longing, "I knew a sailor once." No one made reply. Miss Hill cleared her throat and spoke again, gently. Of course, the bread box may not be the perfect solution. We might take the captain from Amy and send him to the boys' home. I say put him in the bread box, said Miss Quince. There followed a discussion on the merits of either course of action. Mrs. Hill, who was basically of a freedom-loving disposition, found it difficult to agree that the captain should be confined in a bread box. But then again, as she considered it, the captain might then change back into a doll. This might serve Amy best. The captain could remain at St. Anne's, kept safely for all concerned until the time came that Amy was 18 years old and would go out into the world. Then she could take the captain with her. Whereas, if the captain were given over to the boys' home, the grief of this very real loss might badly affect Amy, for it was doubtful she would ever see him again. Miss Quince did not look so deeply into the problem. One drawer in her classroom desk was filled with balls and tops and such treasures that a teacher may gain from a classroom full of children, and she never gave back a thing. Neither did she inspect her trove, nor did she take any pleasure in it, nor did she have any use for it. But year after year the deep drawer filled up, all the merriment in it fall into silence, until at last the deepest treasures in it were forgotten even by the children who had supposed that a part of their heart had been taken from them. And so, aside from her misery towards sailors, it was Miss Quince's nature to want to put the captain in a bread box. But Mrs. Hill could not decide. She considered also the added danger of sending the captain to the boys' home, for Amy might run away then. Now and then, being grievously set against the world in their minds, girls had run away from St. Anne's, which was a scandal, and the poorest sort of example to the other girls. "Oh," moaned Mrs. Hill, bowing to the doubt and pressure of the decision. "Oh, to know what is best, the bread box or the boys' home!" Miss Eclair had for some time been away in her memories. She was now looking out the window directly in back of the couch, behind which lay Amy and the captain. Out that way was the sea. Now Miss Eclair spoke again, this time more slowly and longingly than ever as she expanded on her theme. "I knew a sailor once. I was 16, and he was a midshipman. He sailed away to the southern seas." Mrs. Hill could not help but be touched by the poignancy of Miss Eclair's voice. She looked up. "And did he ever come back?" she asked sympathetically. "Never," said Miss Eclair. "Never." "There you are!" cried Miss Quince. "I should say that settles it. Put him in a bread box." And so it was, pushed so relentlessly in this direction, and with this last exchange falling so definitely on the side of Miss Quince, that Mrs. Hill at last decided that the captain should be taken from Amy that very evening after supper, and put into a bread box. The business of the meeting thus disastrously concluded, two of the high ladies returned to their duties. Miss Eclair remained a while at the table. She drifted over to the window and stood silently in front of the couch, gazing out toward the sea. Miss Eclair several times sighed. Presently, she was raised to poetry by her memories. She recited a rhapsody for her lost midshipman, who never came back, her face as soft as the moon behind a cloud. "Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." At this place Miss Eclair heard a sob, and she spied Amy's blonde hair behind the couch. "Amy!" she said, putting a knee on the couch. "Oh, Miss Eclair!" cried Amy, raising her tearful face from behind the couch. "Don't let them! Oh, please don't let them!" Miss Eclair ran to close the library door. She returned and sat on the couch, holding Amy closely and comforting her. As for the captain, he was ready to leap out a window and run, except for fear of the dog. He had calculated that if he were to lie in a bread box until Amy was 18, it would be 8 more whole years of darkness and the smell of stale bread besides. Even though he might remember exactly where Tasmania was in that time, the knowledge seemed not worth it. He decided to make a run for the door, but Miss Eclair caught his eye, and he emerged around the corner of the couch. And the captain saw a look that promised him no harm, so he stayed. Perhaps Miss Eclair was not newly hatched at middle age each day.